The year was 1869, and the dust was a constant god. It rose in ghostly plumes from beneath the iron-rimmed wheels of the wagons, settled in a fine grit on every surface, and coated the back of Clara Mae Thompson's throat. It was the taste of hope and the taste of despair, the very substance of their slow crawl toward Northern California. They were a small train. Just a dozen families bound together by the shared dream of a life wrested from the unforgiving soil near the Oregon border. For Clara, the dream was already a ghost. The cholera that had swept through their party 2 months prior had taken her mother and father within a week of each other, leaving her an orphan at 19, adrift in a sea of strangers who offered pity but little comfort. The attack came without warning, a sudden, piercing shriek that ripped through the sleepy afternoon air. It was a sound that belonged to nightmares, not to the sun-drenched landscape of sagebrush and jagged rock. Clara was walking beside her family's wagon, leading the tired ox, when the world erupted into chaos. Warriors on horseback, their bodies streaked with red and black paint, descended from the rocky bluffs like vengeful spirits. The crack of rifles blended with the splintering of wood and the screams of men and women. Clara froze, her mind a blank slate of terror. The ox bellowed and strained against its yoke. She saw Mr. Henderson, the train's captain, fall from his horse with a dark stain spreading across his chest. She saw arrows thud into the canvas of the wagon behind hers. There was no order, no defense, only a desperate, futile scramble for survival. A warrior with a face like a hawk's swooped past, his horse's hot breath washing over her. She stumbled back, tripping over a loose stone, and fell hard against the wagon wheel. Before she could rise, a powerful hand seized her arm, hauling her to her feet. She looked up into a pair of black, unreadable eyes. The man was broad and muscular, the scent of sweat, leather, and something wild clinging to him. He said nothing, simply slung her over his shoulder as if she were a sack of grain. Her bonnet fell away, and her long brown hair tumbled free, catching in the rough buckskin of his shirt. The world turned into a dizzying kaleidoscope of dust, sky, and violence. She beat against his back with her fists, but it was like striking a stone wall. He carried her to his horse, threw her across its withers, and swung up behind her. With a sharp cry, he spurred the animal forward, leaving the wreckage of the wagon train, the wreckage of her life, to vanish behind them in a cloud of dust and smoke. They rode for what felt like days, though it was likely only hours. The landscape shifted from open plains to dense, misty forests of pine and fir. The air grew cooler, damp with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. They climbed into jagged mountains that clawed at a slate-gray sky, a place that felt older and more primal than any she had ever known. Finally, they descended into a sheltered valley where a small river snaked through a meadow. This was the Modoc camp. It was not a collection of teepees, as she had imagined from stories back east. The dwellings were sturdy lodges made from cedar planks and tule reeds, built low to the ground to withstand the wind and snow. Smoke curled from holes in their roofs, mingling with the ever-present mist that clung to the valley floor. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat and curing hides. Dozens of people moved through the camp, their faces turning to watch as her captor rode in. Their expressions were a mixture of triumph, curiosity, and a deep, unnerving hostility. Clara was pulled from the horse and her feet hit the ground, her legs buckling beneath her. She was property now, a spoil of war. The warrior who had taken her shoved her forward, toward the center of the camp. An older man with a face like a wrinkled map and hair the color of snow stepped out from the largest lodge. He was the chief, Cale, a man whose name was spoken with fear by the white settlers in the territory. He circled her, his eyes examining her as a rancher would a new piece of livestock. He grunted, a sound of satisfaction, and spoke to her captor in their guttural tongue. Clara was taken not to a lodge, but to a small, isolated hut made of woven branches and mud, set apart from the others. It was dark inside, with only a small opening for a door covered by a hide flap. The floor was packed earth, the only furnishing a pile of furs in one corner. This was her prison. 2 women brought her a bowl of water and a piece of tough, smoked venison, setting it on the ground without a word or a glance in her direction. Then they left, and a young warrior, no older than she was, took up a position outside the hut, a spear held loosely in his hand. In the suffocating silence, Clara's mind began to race, a maelstrom of terror and fury. The shock wore off, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound from outside the camp a prelude to more violence. She was utterly alone, stripped of her name, her family, her future. She was a thing, a bargaining chip. The thought was a bitter acid in her stomach. Anger, hot and fierce, surged through her. Anger at the warriors who had taken her, at the God who had abandoned her, at the cruel fate that had left her orphaned only to be enslaved. She was Clara Mae Thompson, daughter of farmers from Kansas, a woman who could read Shakespeare and play the piano. She was not a beast to be bartered. But here, in this misty valley, what she was mattered less than what she represented. A prize. Days bled into one another. She was led out of the hut only to work. Under the watchful eyes of the women, she was taught to grind acorns into flour, a back-breaking task that left her hands raw and bleeding. She scraped fat from deer hides until her arms ached with a fire she thought would never cease. The women spoke to her only in commands, their faces hard and unforgiving. The children sometimes crept closer, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, before being shooed away by their mothers. The younger warriors were the worst. They would loiter near her work area, making comments in their own language that were clearly meant to intimidate and degrade her. Their laughter was sharp and cruel, their stares lingering on her body in a way that made her skin crawl. She learned to keep her eyes down, to make herself small, to build a wall of ice around the raw fear in her heart. To show weakness, she sensed, was to invite disaster. The most immediate threat, however, came from Chief Cale. He would often stand and watch her work, a possessive gleam in his old eyes. One of the women, who spoke a few words of broken English, made his intentions clear. "Chief take you," she had said, pointing a finger at Clara, then at Cale's lodge. "Make Modoc's son. Good for tribe." The idea of being forced into the old man's bed, of being used to breed a stronger generation, filled her with a horror so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. He wanted her not as a woman, but as a symbol of his victory over the white invaders, a broodmare for his lineage. It was on a cold, drizzly afternoon, perhaps a week into her captivity, that a new figure appeared in the camp. He rode in not with the fury of a returning warrior, but with the quiet, weary posture of a long-distance traveler. He was different from the others. He wore the dusty, practical clothes of a white cowboy, denim trousers, a worn leather vest, and a battered hat that shadowed his face. But he sat his horse with the innate grace of a native rider, and his feet were clad in soft-soled moccasins. When he dismounted and removed his hat, Clara saw his face clearly for the first time. He was a man caught between two worlds. His skin was the color of burnished copper, his cheekbones high and sharp like the Modoc, but his eyes were a startling hazel green, and his jaw was framed by a dark, closely trimmed beard in the style of a white man. He moved with a silent confidence, his gaze sweeping over the camp, missing nothing. He was met by Cale and the other elders, and though they spoke in the Modoc tongue, his voice was calmer, lower than theirs. Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in days, a sliver of desperate, irrational hope. He was a link to the world she had lost, but that hope was quickly extinguished. He was likely a traitor, a gun runner, a man who profited from the conflicts on the frontier. He was no savior. She saw him glance in her direction, his hazel eyes resting on her for a moment. It was not the leering look of the young warriors or the possessive stare of the chief. It was an assessing, intelligent gaze, one that seemed to see not just a captive white woman, but the fear and defiance warring within her. Then he turned away, disappearing into Cale's lodge with the other leaders. Later that day, the man sought her out. The guard at her hut stepped aside to let him pass, and he ducked through the low entrance, filling the small space with his presence. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice a low baritone. The sound of her own name, spoken in perfect English, was so startling she almost wept. She remained silent, huddled in the furs, eyeing him with suspicion. "My name is Eli," he continued, keeping a respectful distance. "I work as a scout for the army. I also carry messages for the Modoc. They trust me. Enough." "What do you want?" Clara's voice was a hoarse whisper, raw from disuse and fear. "I've been sent to negotiate your release," he said plainly. "The attack on your wagon train has caused an uproar. The soldiers at Fort Bidwell are preparing to ride out. If they come, there will be a battle. Many will die on both sides." Clara's heart leaped. Release. The word was a prayer she hadn't dared to utter. "Then get me out of here," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Eli's expression was grim. He shook his head slowly. "It's not that simple. Cale sees you as a prize. To just give you back would make him look weak to his young warriors, the ones who are pushing for all-out war. They would see it as a surrender." "So I'm to stay here? To be given to that old man?" The venom in her voice surprised even herself. "That is his plan," Eli confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "He believes a marriage to you, and a child from that union, would solidify his power and show that the Modoc can absorb the strength of their enemies." The cold dread returned, chilling her to the bone. Her hope crumbled into ash. She was trapped in a political game she couldn't begin to understand, a pawn whose life meant nothing. Eli watched her, his face a mask of contemplation. He seemed to be weighing his words, his options. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of rain drumming on the hut's roof. "There might be another way," he said at last, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "A way to prevent a war and keep you from Cale's lodge." She looked up, her eyes desperate. "What way?" Eli's hazel eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the immense burden he carried, standing with a foot in two worlds that wanted to destroy each other. According to their law, a woman who is claimed by a man cannot be taken by another, not even the chief, he explained slowly, deliberately. "It would be a great dishonor. It would avert a war with the army, and it would protect you from Cale." Clara stared at him, confused. "Claimed? What are you talking about?" He took a steadying breath, his gaze never leaving her face. "I am talking about proposing a solution to the council. I am half Modoc. I have a right to take a wife from the tribe. If I claim you as mine, Cale cannot have you. The soldiers will not attack a settlement to retrieve a scout's wife. It would be an arrangement, a temporary one, to keep the peace." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the small, dark hut. "I am proposing, Miss Thompson, to marry you." The word hung in the air of the small hut, as foreign and unbelievable as the idea of snow in summer. Marry. For a moment, Clara could do nothing but stare at him, at this man who was both a stranger and her only link to a world that no longer existed. Then, a bitter, hysterical laugh escaped her lips. It was a ragged, broken sound. "Marry you?" she finally choked out, the words dripping with scorn. She scrambled to her feet, putting the meager space of the hut between them. "You are no different from them. You see a chance and you take it. First, I am a prize for an old chief, and now I am a convenient solution for a half-breed scout. Is this what my life has become? To be passed from one man's hand to another's like a worn-out coin?" Her voice rose with every word, fueled by a week of terror and impotent rage. "I will not do it. I would rather take my chances with the soldiers. I would rather face Cale himself than willingly place a collar around my own neck for your benefit." Eli remained perfectly still, his hazel eyes watching her with an unnerving calm. He did not flinch at the venom in her words. He simply let her fury wash over him, like a rock in a churning river. When her tirade exhausted itself and she was left breathing in ragged gasps, he finally spoke, his voice low and devoid of pity. "Your chances with the soldiers are a battle that will burn this valley to the ground, with you in the middle of it. Your chances with Cale are a life of servitude in his bed. Bearing children you will not be allowed to love as your own. You speak of a collar. Miss Thompson, you have been wearing a collar since the moment you were pulled from that wagon. You just haven't been able to see it." He took a step closer, not menacingly, but with the deliberate motion of a man laying out undeniable facts. "Right now, you are unclaimed property. You belong to the tribe as a whole, which is why Cale, as chief, can make a claim on you. It is also why any of those young warriors out there feel they have a right to stare at you, to taunt you. To them, you are a thing. If I claim you, you are no longer a thing. You become a person under my protection. You will belong to someone, and in this world, for a woman in your position. Belonging to someone is the only thing that keeps you from belonging to everyone." His logic was brutal, cold, and utterly terrifying because she knew, in the deepest part of her soul, that he was right. She had felt it in the eyes that followed her every move, in the possessive way Cale watched her, in the casual cruelty of her captors. She was an object, and objects did not have the luxury of choice. Still, the defiant part of her, the part that was still Clara Mae Thompson from Kansas, refused to surrender. "Protection?" she scoffed. "What kind of protection can one man offer against an entire tribe that hates me?" Before Eli could answer, a commotion outside the hut drew their attention. A sharp, angry voice shouted in the Modoc tongue, followed by the sound of something heavy being knocked over. Eli's face hardened. He motioned for her to stay put and slipped out through the hide flap. Clara crept to the opening and peered out. 3 of the young warriors who tormented her most often had cornered one of the older women, the one who had given her instructions on her first day. They had overturned a basket of roots she was carrying, and now they stood over her, their posture aggressive. The lead warrior, a man named Chakotay, whose face was marred by a long scar across his cheek, was speaking in a low, menacing tone, jabbing a finger toward Clara's hut. The old woman shook her head, muttering a reply. Eli strode toward them, his walk unhurried but radiating a palpable authority. He spoke to them in their own language, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. Chakotay turned on him, spitting a reply. The 2 men stood face to face. A silent battle of wills fought in the space of a few heartbeats. The other warriors shifted their weight, their hands straying toward the knives at their belts. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the damp air. Finally, with a last hateful glare directed at Clara's hut, Chakotay and his friends turned and stalked away. Eli helped the old woman to her feet and gathered the scattered roots. He exchanged a few quiet words with her before turning and coming back to the hut. He ducked inside, his expression grim. "That was about you," he said, answering her unspoken question. "They are angry. They say I have no right to negotiate for you, that a white woman's blood has no place in the council of the Modoc. They believe you should be made an example of." He looked her directly in the eye. "That is the protection I am offering. The choice is yours, but you need to make it soon." He left her then, alone with the chilling echo of his words and the memory of the raw hatred in Chakotay's eyes. The walls of the hut felt as if they were closing in. Her defiance was a flickering candle in a hurricane, and she felt it beginning to dim. The final blow came the next morning. Clara was tasked with carrying water from the river, a young boy trailing her as a guard. As she neared the bank, she saw another woman, scrubbing clothes against a flat rock. She was white, her hair was a dull, matted blonde. and her dress was a tattered patchwork of buckskin and faded calico. But it was her face, her eyes, that made Clara's blood run cold. They were utterly vacant, hollowed-out shells that registered nothing. She moved with the slow, shuffling gait of an automaton, her hands raw and chapped, her shoulders slumped in a posture of permanent defeat. Clara stopped, staring. The boy guarding her grunted and gave her a shove to keep moving, but she couldn't tear her gaze away. Other Modoc women worked nearby, ignoring the blonde woman completely, as if she were a rock or a tree. She had no name, no voice. She was simply there, a tool to be used, her spirit so thoroughly broken that she had ceased to be a person. Clara saw her own future in that woman's empty eyes. She saw a life worse than a quick death, a slow descent into nothingness, until Clara Mae Thompson was gone forever, replaced by a nameless, will-less slave. That was the moment her pride shattered. The fear she had been holding at bay crashed over her in a tidal wave, drowning everything else. This wasn't about dignity or choice anymore. It was about survival. It was about not becoming that woman by the river. Her hands shaking, she set down the water buckets. She turned to Eli's lodge, a slightly larger, more solid structure than her hut, and walked toward it with a grim resolve. She found him sitting outside, mending a piece of tack. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her voice was a dry, broken whisper. "I accept." Eli simply nodded, as if he had been expecting it. "The ceremony will be this evening," he said. There was no celebration, no joyful gathering. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eli led her away from the camp and into the quiet sanctity of the pine forest. Cale and 2 other elders were the only witnesses. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. The ceremony was as stark and untamed as the landscape around them. One of the elders chanted in a low monotone, the ancient words absorbed by the silent trees. Cale watched with his impassive, reptilian gaze, his face giving no hint of his thoughts. Eli stood beside her, silent and solid. He did not touch her. When the chanting stopped, Eli produced a thin, silver necklace. It was simple, a delicate chain with a single, small, turquoise stone at its center. It was not a wedding ring forged in the fires of a town smithy, but an object born of this wild land. He held it out to her. For a moment, she hesitated. This was the final act, the sealing of her fate. Then, thinking of the woman with the hollow eyes, she bowed her head. Eli's fingers brushed the back of her neck as he fastened the clasp. The metal was cool against her skin. It was a mark of their bargain, a symbol of protection that felt as heavy as any shackle. One of the elders grunted, and it was over. She was, in the eyes of the Modoc, Eli's wife. They walked back to his lodge in silence. He had moved her meager belongings from the prison hut earlier in the day. The inside was larger and cleaner, with a raised sleeping platform covered in thick bear and buffalo hides, and a small, well-tended fire pit in the center. But to Clara, it felt like a cage, just a slightly bigger one. The tension of the first night in their shared lodge was a palpable thing. Clara sat on one side of the small, crackling fire, wrapping her arms around her knees, while Eli sat on the other, sharpening his knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone against steel was the only sound. Neither of them spoke. The ceremony had changed everything and nothing. They were husband and wife, but they were also captor and captive, 2 profound strangers bound by a desperate contract. When it was clear no words would be spoken, Eli rose. He took one of the thickest buffalo robes from the sleeping platform and laid it on the dirt floor, on the far side of the fire pit. Then he took another blanket and placed it carefully on the raised platform, creating a clear line down the middle of the furs. Clara watched his every move, her body rigid with apprehension. What would he expect of her now? The law of this land and the law of her own world gave him rights to her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Eli lay down on the makeshift bed on the floor, turning his back to her. He was a dark shape in the flickering firelight, a man of shadows and secrets. After a long, heavy silence, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the small lodge. "I will not touch you," he said, his words directed at the wall. "Unless you want me to." The promise hung in the air between them. It was a gift of agency when she had none left, a sliver of respect in a world that had shown her none. It did not make him her savior, and it did not make this lodge a home. But it proved one thing, a thing that mattered more than anything else in that moment. He was not Cale. He was not Chakotay. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara felt a single, fragile tear trace a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't sleep, but lay awake in the darkness, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, the silver necklace cold against her skin. The days that followed settled into a strange and silent rhythm, a domesticity without warmth. Their lodge became a shared space, governed by unspoken rules. Clara slept on the raised platform, Eli on the floor. They rarely spoke, yet he became her shadow, her instructor in a world designed to kill her. He was a man of action, not words. He did not explain the philosophy of survival. He demonstrated it. He showed her how to build a fire with damp wood, arranging the kindling in a way that coaxed a smokeless flame. He taught her which plants were safe to eat, the starchy camas root that had to be cooked for hours to remove its poison, the tart wild berries that grew in shaded groves, and which ones would bring a swift, painful end. He would point to a mushroom, then draw a finger across his throat. The message was clear. He taught her how to read the clouds as they scudded over the mountain peaks, to know when a storm was coming hours before the first drop of rain fell. He showed her how to cure a strip of venison over the fire pit, turning it until it was tough and black but would last for weeks. These were not gentle lessons. He was a demanding teacher, his patience thin for mistakes that, in the wild, would mean the difference between life and death. But beneath the harsh practicality, Clara began to sense something else. It was in the way he always positioned himself between her and the rest of the camp when they were outside. A silent, human shield. The leering taunts from Chakotay and his friends did not cease, but they became more muted, thrown from a greater distance. A lingering stare would be met by Eli's cold, unblinking gaze until the other man looked away. A muttered comment would cause Eli's hand to drop casually to the hilt of the knife at his belt. He never said, "I am protecting you," but his every action screamed it. Slowly, imperceptibly, Clara's terror began to recede, replaced by a cautious, fragile trust. She no longer saw him as a captor, but as a bulwark against a sea of threats. He was a dangerous man. She knew that. She had seen the capacity for violence simmering just beneath his calm exterior. But she was coming to understand that his danger was not directed at her. It was reserved for the world, for anyone who might try to harm her. It was a strange and unsettling form of security, but it was the only security she had. The breaking point came on a night thick with the scent of roasted meat and fermented berries. A hunting party had returned with 2 large bucks, and the camp was alive with a celebratory fervor that bordered on mania. A great bonfire roared in the central clearing, casting dancing, monstrous shadows against the lodges. The drums beat a frantic, hypnotic rhythm, and the men passed skins of a potent, home-brewed liquor from hand to hand. Eli had forbidden Clara from leaving the lodge. "Stay inside," he had commanded, his voice tight. "Don't let anyone see you." He had gone to the council fire, a necessary appearance, leaving her alone in the relative quiet of their shelter. From inside, Clara could hear the celebration escalating. The drumming grew louder, wilder. Shouts and drunken laughter cut through the night. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She sat huddled by their small fire, the silver necklace Eli had given her clutched in her fist. Suddenly, the hide flap of their lodge was ripped aside. A figure stumbled in, silhouetted against the raging bonfire outside. The stench of liquor filled the small space. It was one of Chakotay's companions, a burly warrior named Kono. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, and a cruel, drunken grin split his face. "The half-breed's woman," he slurred in broken English, taking a staggering step toward her. "Too good for Modoc, man, eh? We see—" Clara scrambled backward, her heart seizing in her chest. There was nowhere to run. "Get out!" she whispered, her voice trembling. He laughed, a guttural, ugly sound. "Kono, take what he wants." He lunged for her, but before his hands could find her, a shadow detached itself from the entrance. Eli moved with a speed that was almost inhuman. He didn't shout, didn't issue a warning. One moment Kono was reaching for Clara, the next he was on the ground, gasping for air. Eli hadn't used his knife, he had used his fists, delivering 2 short, brutal blows to the man's stomach and jaw. The sound of the impact was sickeningly wet and solid. Kono crumpled without a sound, unconscious before he hit the packed earth floor. The lodge was suddenly silent, save for Clara's ragged breathing and the distant thrum of the drums. Eli stood over the unconscious form, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked at Clara, his hazel eyes blazing in the firelight. "We're leaving," he said, his voice a low growl. He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with an urgency that tolerated no argument. "Now." He pulled her out of the lodge and into the chaotic night. No one seemed to notice them. They melted into the shadows at the edge of the camp and then into the absolute darkness of the forest. The sounds of the celebration faded behind them as they ran. Eli leading her through the dense undergrowth with an unerring sense of direction. Rain began to fall, a cold, steady drizzle that soaked them in minutes. They climbed, their feet slipping on wet rocks and slick pine needles, until they reached a small, dark opening in the side of a granite cliff face, a cave. Eli pushed her gently inside. It was shallow, barely more than an overhang, but it was dry. He set about building a fire with the same swift efficiency he did everything else. Using dry wood he pulled from a crevice deep within the rock. Soon, a small, cheerful fire was crackling, pushing back the damp and the dark. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames. The shared terror and the frantic escape had stripped away the layers of formality and distance between them. In the intimate glow of the fire, they were no longer protector and protected, but simply a man and a woman who had fled into the night. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice quiet. "Thank you." Eli just nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Back in Kansas," she began, the words coming in a sudden rush, as if a dam had broken inside her. "My family had a farm. We weren't rich, but we had enough. I had a younger brother, Thomas. He was only 10. She paused, the memory a physical ache in her chest. There was a fever one winter. It took him in 3 days. After that, the house was always quiet. My mother stopped singing. My father just worked until he collapsed. It was like the light had gone out of our lives. I've never felt so alone." She looked at Eli, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Even when my parents were still alive, I felt alone. And now—" Her voice trailed off. Eli was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he hadn't been listening. But then he turned his head, and his eyes, softened by the firelight, met hers. "I know what it is to be alone," he said, his voice raspy. He shifted, turning to face her more fully. "My mother was a white woman, the daughter of a trapper. My father was a Modoc war chief. They met when he saved her from a bear. It's a long story." He gave a small, humorless smile. "They tried to make a life together, between the worlds. It didn't work. The white people saw my father as a savage and my mother as a traitor for lying with him. They called me a half-breed. a name they spit like poison. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. But the Modoc, they were no better. To them, I was always the white woman's son. My blood wasn't pure. I learned their ways. I can hunt and track better than any of them. But I was never truly one of them. I don't belong in a town, and I don't belong in a camp. I belong out here, in the spaces in between. His confession settled in the small cave, a truth as raw and bare as the rock around them. For the first time, Clara truly saw him. She saw past the stoic scout, the dangerous warrior, and saw the lonely boy who had been rejected by both halves of his own identity. He was an exile in his own land, just as she was. Their loneliness was different in its shape and origin, but it was the same in its aching depth. In that moment, they were not white and Modoc, not man and woman, but two solitary souls finding a flicker of recognition in the other's eyes. An unspoken understanding passed between them, without thinking, moved by an instinct she didn't know she possessed. Clara shifted closer and gently rested her head on his shoulder. His body went rigid, a sudden tension in the hard muscle beneath her cheek. She could feel the heat of him, smell the scent of rain, leather, and wood smoke that clung to him. It was the first time she had willingly touched him. For a few perfect seconds. There was no fear, no bargain, no pretense. There was only the quiet comfort of another person's presence in the vast, empty darkness. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled away. He stood up abruptly, his movements jerky. He strode to the mouth of the cave and stood with his back to her, staring out into the black, rainy night. His voice, when he spoke, was a ragged, strained thing she had never heard before. "If I stay in here another minute," he said, his words tight with a fierce, suppressed emotion, "I won't be able to keep my promise." He stepped out of the cave and into the rain, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Clara alone by the fire, her heart hammering in the sudden silence, the place on her cheek still burning where it had rested against his shoulder. Eli returned before dawn, a silent shadow soaked by the persistent rain. They did not speak of what had happened, of his abrupt departure from the cave or the raw confession that hung in the air between them. They walked back to the Modoc camp as the sun rose, painting the misty valley in hues of soft gray and rose. The silence was different now, no longer empty but filled with a heavy, unspoken tension. It was a silence that acknowledged a line had been crossed, a truth revealed that could not be taken back. Their return was met with a wall of suspicion. Kono, the warrior Eli had struck down, had been found and carried to his lodge, his jaw swollen and his pride deeply wounded. The story had spread through the camp like wildfire, twisted and embellished with every telling. They were no longer seen as a man and his unfortunate burden. They were viewed as conspirators. Whispers followed them like smoke. The women who had once ignored Clara now glared at her with open hostility. The young warriors, led by the scarred Chakotay, watched Eli with a new, challenging light in their eyes. He was no longer a neutral intermediary. He was a man defending a white woman with his fists. The most significant change was in Chief Kale. The old man's gaze, once merely possessive, was now laced with a shrewd, calculating suspicion. He would watch Eli from across the camp, his wrinkled face a mask of stone. Kale no longer saw a clever political solution. He saw a man compromised, a man who had perhaps been bewitched by the very prize he was meant to control. Eli's usefulness as a bridge between two worlds was eroding, and, in its place, a dangerous perception was taking root, that he had chosen a side. In the face of this rising hostility, Eli retreated further into himself. The space he had kept between them in the lodge widened into a chasm. He spoke to Clara only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. He no longer sat with her by the fire in the evenings. Instead, he would stand guard outside the lodge, a solitary figure against the night, until he was sure she was asleep. His avoidance was a physical ache for Clara. The brief, fragile connection they had forged in the cave was gone, and she felt its loss keenly. She was lonelier now, in his presence, than she had been when she was truly alone in her prison hut. But while Eli built walls, Clara began to tentatively dismantle her own. His promise in the cave, "You belong to no one, not even me," had planted a seed of strength in her. She was not property. She was a survivor. She threw herself into the routines of the camp, not with the sullen obedience of a captive, but with the focus of a student. She mastered the difficult art of leaching the bitterness from acorn flour. She learned to weave tule reeds into watertight baskets. The women, seeing her genuine effort, slowly began to thaw. One taught her how to make a simple, hearty bread from camas flour, a staple of their diet. Another showed her how to tend to the small flock of scrawny chickens that scratched in the dirt between the lodges. These small tasks became her salvation. They filled the long, empty hours and gave her a sense of purpose. In the evenings, when the moon was a silver disk in the clear mountain sky, she would sometimes sit in the doorway of their lodge and hum the hymns her mother used to sing. It was a quiet act of defiance, a way of reclaiming a small piece of herself. The soft, sad melodies would drift into the night, a stark contrast to the rhythmic beat of the Modoc drums, and sometimes she would see Eli pause in his solitary watch, his head tilted as if listening. The autumn rains came in earnest, turning the camp into a sea of mud and misery. A cold, damp chill seeped into the lodges, and a sickness followed, bringing with it fevers and racking coughs. Clara, whose body was not accustomed to the harshness of this life, was one of the first to fall ill. It started with a shiver she couldn't shake. By nightfall, she was burning with fever. The lodge spun around her, the familiar shapes of their belongings melting into monstrous shadows. She was adrift in a sea of disjointed memories. Her mother's cool hand on her forehead, the smell of Kansas soil after a storm, the terror of the wagon train attack, the vacant eyes of the woman by the river. Through the haze of delirium, one presence remained constant. Eli, he did not leave her side. He broke his self-imposed exile, kneeling beside her on the sleeping platform, bathing her face and neck with a cloth dipped in cool water. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark and patiently coaxed the liquid between her lips. Her fevered mind couldn't make sense of it. He was a paradox, a man who kept his distance as if she were poison, yet now held her as if she were precious. In the deepest part of the night, as the rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof, she thrashed in a nightmare, crying out for her brother. Thomas, a strong, gentle hand enclosed hers. Holding it fast, she quieted, anchoring herself to the solid warmth of his grasp. She heard his voice, a low murmur near her ear. Not meant for a conscious mind to hear, it was a confession whispered to a soul lost in fever dreams. "You're not a prize to be won," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You're not a symbol for a chief, or a treaty for the army, or a reason for a war. You belong to no one, not even me." The words pierced through her delirium, a beacon of light in the darkness. They were the most profound act of liberation she had ever known. She clung to his hand and let the fever pull her back under. But this time, she did not dream of fear. Clara awoke to the soft gray light of dawn. The rain had stopped. The lodge was quiet, the air cool and clean. The fever had broken. She felt weak, as if her bones were made of water. But her mind was clear. She turned her head and a gasp caught in her throat. Eli was asleep, his head resting on her legs. He was slumped over, his body contorted in an uncomfortable position, one of his hands still loosely clutching hers. His face, usually a mask of stoic control, was softened in sleep. There were lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, and his dark hair had fallen across his forehead. In that moment, he was not the formidable scout or the feared warrior. He was just a man, vulnerable and worn out from a long night's vigil. A wave of overwhelming tenderness washed over her, so powerful it made her ache. He had stayed. He had cared for her, protected her from the nightmares, and anchored her to this world. He had kept his promise to protect her, but he had also broken his promise to keep his distance, all for her sake. Slowly, carefully, she raised her free hand and brushed the stray lock of hair from his forehead. His skin was warm. The gesture was intimate, proprietary, and it felt more natural than anything she had done in months. He stirred at her touch, his eyelids fluttering, his hazel eyes opened, clouded with sleep, and for a moment, he seemed confused, disoriented. Then his gaze cleared and focused on her. He realized where he was, his head in her lap, and he tensed, about to pull away, the familiar mask of distance ready to slam back into place. "Don't," she whispered, her voice raspy. She didn't remove her hand from his hair, but instead gently stroked it. "Eli." He froze, watching her, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. The choice was hers now. She was not a captive, not a prize, not a helpless victim of circumstance. She was a woman who knew what she wanted. "You don't have to keep your promise anymore," she said, her voice growing stronger, clearer. "The one you made that first night, about not touching me." She saw a flicker of understanding, of disbelief in his eyes. "If you want me," she finished, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "I am here." It was an absolution. It was an invitation. For a long moment, he didn't move. He simply stared up at her, as if trying to decipher a language he had never heard before. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised a hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. The touch was electric, a jolt of lightning after a long drought. He pushed himself up, his movements fluid, and knelt before her on the furs. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, his eyes burning with a raw, pent-up longing that mirrored her own. "Said everything." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a collision. It was clumsy and desperate and hungry. The kiss of two people who had been starved for so long. It was the taste of rain and smoke and fever and want. All the walls he had built, all the fear she had harbored, crumbled into dust in that single shattering moment. His hands went to her hair, tangling in the long strands, pulling her closer. Hers found their way around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. The simple cotton of her nightdress felt impossibly thin, the rough wool of his shirt a welcome friction against her skin. There was an awkwardness to their movements, a fumbling uncertainty of two people learning each other for the first time. But beneath it was a burning, undeniable passion that swept away all hesitation. It was the explosive release of weeks of stolen glances, unspoken thoughts, and forbidden proximity. It was the fierce, beautiful, and messy culmination of two lonely souls finally finding their way home in each other's arms. The morning after was a world remade. The invisible walls that had defined the space within their lodge had dissolved, and the silence that greeted the dawn was no longer heavy with restraint, but soft with a new and tender intimacy. When Clara awoke, she was wrapped in Eli's arms, her head resting on his chest, the steady beat of his heart a comforting rhythm beneath her ear. He was already awake, his hazel eyes watching her with an expression of such unguarded warmth that it made her breath catch. Their relationship, born of violence and necessity, was reborn in that fire-lit lodge. The rigid contract between them was replaced by an unspoken covenant of the heart. Words were still sparse, but they were no longer needed. Their new language was one of small, significant gestures. It was the way his hand would find hers as they walked through the camp, his fingers lacing through hers in a simple, possessive act. It was the way she would save him the best piece of roasted meat, placing it on his plate with a small, private smile. It was the way he would bring her a cluster of late-blooming wildflowers he'd found on a hunt, a silent offering that spoke volumes. The lodge, once her cage, became their sanctuary. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, his arm draped around her shoulders, her head resting against him as she had in the cave. The clumsy jealousy mentioned in the outline was subtle but present. If Chakotay or his followers stared too long at Clara while she fetched water, Eli's posture would stiffen, his hand resting on his knife until they moved on. And once, when a young Modoc woman spoke to Eli for a moment too long, her hand brushing his arm, Clara felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang of possessiveness that surprised her with its intensity. She turned away, pretending to be busy with her weaving, but Eli had seen it. Later, he came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and whispered in her ear, "There is no one else," a reassurance she hadn't even known she needed. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Eli first spoke of a future beyond the jagged peaks that imprisoned them. "This isn't a life for you, Clara," he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "This camp, the hate is growing. Cale watches us. He sees you're not a captive anymore." "Where would we go?" she asked, the idea of a we beyond these circumstances both thrilling and terrifying. "I know a place," he said, a distant, hopeful look in his eyes. "North of here, in the Lost River Valley. It's quiet land, neutral ground, no soldiers, no war parties. Enough water for a small herd, good soil for a garden. We could build a cabin, a real home, just us." The dream he painted was so vivid, so fiercely desirable, that it hurt. A cabin with a real floor and glass windows, a garden where she could grow corn and beans, a life where she didn't have to look over her shoulder, where his touch wasn't a secret defiance but a simple, everyday fact. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she allowed herself to hope for a future with him. But their fragile dream was built on borrowed time, and their time was running out. Cale was a shrewd and patient man. He had allowed Eli's marriage as a temporary measure to appease the army and placate his own people. He had watched the scout and the white woman, expecting the arrangement to remain a cold, political one. But what he saw now was something else entirely. He saw the shared glances, the easy intimacy, the fierce protectiveness in Eli's eyes. He saw a man who had not just claimed a woman, but had given his allegiance to her. And that, in Cale's eyes, was a betrayal. Eli was no longer a useful tool. He was a rogue element, and his bond with the white woman was a threat to the chief's authority. He chose his moment carefully. During a council of the elders and warriors gathered around the central fire, Eli was present, seated among the men, with Clara watching nervously from the entrance to their lodge. Cale rose, his old frame still imposing. "The time for games is over," he announced, his voice carrying across the clearing. His black eyes swept over the assembled men before landing on Eli. "The scout, Eli has served his purpose. He has kept the woman safe while the soldiers' tempers cooled. For this, we are grateful." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But this was an arrangement of convenience, not a union of the spirit. The woman's blood is strong. It will be joined with the blood of a true Modoc warrior to forge a new generation, a generation that will carry the strength of both peoples." A murmur ran through the crowd. Clara's blood ran cold. Cale raised a hand for silence. "I have chosen a husband for her. She will be given to Chakotay. Their union will strengthen our people and bind her to us forever." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Chakotay, the scarred, hateful warrior who embodied all her fears, grinned with triumphant cruelty. Before anyone else could react, Eli was on his feet. The stoic calm he always wore was gone, replaced by a blaze of pure fury. "No," he said, his voice ringing with absolute defiance. "She is my wife. She belongs with me. No one will take her." The gasp that went through the council was audible. To openly defy the chief in such a way was unthinkable. It was a direct challenge to his power, an insult to the entire tribe. Cale's face was a mask of cold rage. "You forget your place, half-breed," he hissed. "You are a guest here, nothing more. You have been poisoned by this white woman's charms." He pointed a trembling finger at Eli. "You will not have her. You are forbidden from leaving this camp. Your weapons will be taken. If you speak one more word of defiance, your life is forfeit." Warriors loyal to Kale and Chakotay immediately surrounded Eli. They roughly tore the pistol from his belt and the knife from its sheath. He didn't resist. He simply stood tall, his eyes locked on Kale, a silent promise of rebellion burning in their depths. Then, he turned his head and looked at Clara, his expression a mixture of fury and a desperate, silent apology before he was shoved back toward their lodge. That night was a torment. 2 warriors were posted outside their lodge, a clear sign they were now prisoners. Inside, the air was thick with desperation. The sanctuary had become a cage once more.
"He means it,"
Clara whispered, her voice shaking.
"He'll give me to Chakotay. He'll kill you."
"Not if we're not here," Eli said, his voice a low, determined growl. He was pacing the small space like a trapped wolf. "We have to run. Tonight is too risky. They'll be watching. But just before dawn, in the hour when the guards are sleepiest, we can slip into the forest. I know a path they won't expect." The plan was reckless, suicidal, but it was the only one they had. Later, when the camp had fallen into a deep slumber and the guards outside were nodding by their small fire, Clara created a diversion, deliberately knocking over a stack of clay pots inside the lodge. In the moment of confusion as the guards peered inside, Eli slipped out the back, a small gap in the tule reeds he had prepared. He met her a few moments later in the deep shadows behind the neighboring lodge. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his hand finding hers in the dark.
"Be ready before the first light."
They spoke for only a minute, finalizing the desperate details of their escape. What they didn't see was a lone figure watching from the deeper shadows of the forest edge. It was Tavy, a quiet warrior who had once been one of Eli's few friends in the camp. Tavy had watched Clara from afar since her arrival, his silent admiration curdling into bitter jealousy when Eli claimed her. He had seen the way they looked at each other, and it ate at him. Overhearing their plan, he saw his chance. By betraying Eli, he could remove his rival and earn a place of honor within Chakotay's powerful faction. A man's ambition, fueled by a bitter heart, can be the deadliest poison of all. In the cold, gray hour just before dawn, they made their move. Silently, they slipped from their lodge. The guards were gone. The camp was eerily quiet. For a single, hopeful moment, they thought they had made it. They reached the edge of the forest, the promise of freedom just a few steps away. And then the world exploded. Torches flared to life all around them, revealing the grim, waiting faces of 24 warriors. Chakotay stepped forward, a triumphant sneer on his face. Behind him stood Tavy, his eyes refusing to meet Eli's. The betrayal was a sudden, brutal blow. There was no escape. Warriors seized Clara. Her frantic screams cut short as a rough hand was clamped over her mouth. She was dragged away, back toward the small, dark hut where her nightmare had begun. Her last sight was of Eli. He didn't struggle as they surrounded him. He simply stood, his eyes fixed on her, his face a mask of heartbreak and defeat. Then the warriors fell upon him. They beat him with fists and club handles, the sickening thuds echoing in the cold morning air. He didn't cry out, taking the punishment with a silent, defiant strength that only seemed to enrage them further. When he finally collapsed into the mud, broken and bleeding, they dragged his unconscious form to the central clearing. They lashed his wrists to a tall wooden post, leaving him strung up and exposed. A brutal example for all to see. The first rays of the sun broke over the mountains, illuminating a scene of utter despair, a woman locked in a cage, and the man who loved her left broken and defeated, awaiting his fate under the cold, unforgiving eyes of his enemies. Darkness. That was the first thing Clara was aware of. A complete, suffocating darkness that pressed in on her from all sides, mirroring the despair that had hollowed out her soul. She was back in the small prison hut, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and defeat. The hide flap was laced shut from the outside, and her wrists were bound tightly with leather thongs. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the camp coming to life, and with it, the agonizing memory of Eli, beaten and broken, left for dead in the central clearing. For hours, she drifted in a state of shock, her mind a numb void. But as the day wore on, a new feeling began to smolder in the ashes of her despair. Rage, a cold, clear fury that burned away the tears and helplessness. They had taken him. They had tried to break him. They had tried to extinguish the one light she had found in this terrible wilderness. And she would not let them. The Clara who had been captured on the trail, the frightened girl who had wept in this very hut, was gone. In her place was a woman with nothing left to lose. Her mind began to work, her senses sharpening. She remembered the lessons Eli had taught her, his practical, unsentimental voice guiding her even now. Look for a tool where there is none. The solution is always there. Her eyes scanned the dark interior of the hut. The packed earth floor was mostly smooth, but in one corner, a small, flat piece of shale protruded slightly from the ground. It was a long shot, a desperate hope. Wriggling and contorting her body, she managed to position herself beside it. With her bound hands, she began to scrape and dig at the dirt around the rock. Her fingers, already raw, were soon bleeding. The pain a distant thrum against the urgency of her task. After what felt like an eternity, she managed to pry it loose. The edge was jagged, not sharp like a knife, but perhaps sharp enough. The next part was an exercise in agonizing patience. She wedged the rock between her knees and began sawing the leather thongs against its rough edge. It was maddeningly slow work, fiber by fiber. The tough leather began to fray. She focused on the task, blocking out the pain, the fear, and the sounds from outside. There was only the rock, the leather, and the image of Eli's face, pale and bloodied, that fueled her. Finally, with a last desperate tug, one of the bonds snapped. Freeing her other hand was quicker. She was free. Night fell again, bringing with it a sliver of moon that cast long, treacherous shadows across the camp. The time had come. Taking a deep breath, she used the edge of the shale to carefully slice at the lacing on the hide flap. She moved with a stealth she didn't know she possessed, a creature of the shadows. Peering out, she saw the camp was quiet. Most were in their lodges, and a single, bored-looking guard was posted not by her hut, but further away, near the central clearing where Eli still hung. She slipped out of the hut, her bare feet making no sound on the damp ground. She moved from shadow to shadow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every cough, every dog's bark, sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She was a ghost, gliding through the place that had been her prison. As she drew closer to the clearing, she saw him. Eli was barely conscious, his head slumped on his chest. His body was a canvas of horrific bruises, his shirt ripped and stained with blood. The sight of him, so utterly broken, nearly made her cry out. She stifled the sound, her rage hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve. The guard was dozing, his head nodding. Now was her only chance. In her hand, she clutched the piece of shale. It was a pathetic weapon, a pathetic tool, but it was all she had. She crept up behind the post, staying in its deep shadow. She reached up and began to saw at the thick ropes binding Eli's wrists. The motion was awkward, and the rope was thicker than the thongs had been. A low groan escaped Eli's lips. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. For a second, he didn't seem to recognize her. "Clara?" he breathed, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. "Hush," she commanded softly, her hands working faster, more desperately. "I'm getting you out of here." The first rope gave way. Eli's body slumped, his entire weight now supported by one arm. He groaned again, a sound of pure agony. The guard stirred, his head jerking up. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. The guard grunted and shifted his position, and then his head drooped once more. With renewed urgency, she attacked the final rope. It snapped, and Eli collapsed, a dead weight, into her arms. He couldn't walk. He could barely stand. Supporting him, with his arms slung over her shoulders, was a monumental task. Every step was a struggle. They were a single, staggering creature, lurching through the darkness. Twice, he stumbled, his weight nearly bringing them both down, but they kept going, driven by her sheer will. They reached the edge of the forest and plunged into its forgiving blackness, leaving the sleeping camp of their nightmares behind them. The days that followed were a blur of misery and survival. They were fugitives with nothing but the tattered clothes on their backs. Clara became the hunter, the provider, the protector. All the skills Eli had taught her were now put to the test. She fashioned crude snares from vines and managed to catch a single, scrawny rabbit, which they roasted over a tiny, smokeless fire and rationed for 2 days. When that was gone, she remembered another of his lessons. With a shudder of revulsion, she dug for grubs under rotting logs and found crickets in the tall grass. She cooked them as he had shown her, and they ate, the bitter taste of survival in their mouths. They slept in hollow logs and under rocky overhangs, huddled together for warmth as the cold autumn rain soaked them to the bone. Eli was in and out of consciousness, his body burning with fever. The deep cuts on his back and chest, untreated and washed with dirty rain, had become infected. Red streaks spread from the wounds across his skin, and they began to ooze a sickly fluid. He was dying. Clara could see it, could smell the scent of sickness on him. She refused to let him go. She remembered the Modoc women, the poultices and remedies they used for everything from coughs to wounds. She remembered one of them chewing a certain kind of leaf, yarrow, she thought it was, and applying it to a deep gash on a child's leg to stop the bleeding and prevent festering. Desperate, she searched the forest, her eyes scanning for familiar plants. She found a patch of the feathery leaves, chewed them into a bitter, green pulp, and gently, carefully, applied the makeshift poultice to his worst wounds. She found moss, thick and green, and used it as a clean dressing to cover them. For his fever, she stripped the bark from a willow tree, just as she'd seen an old woman do, and boiled it in a small, cupped piece of bark to make a bitter tea, forcing the liquid past his cracked lips. She tended to him constantly, her world shrinking to the singular task of keeping him alive. She cleaned his wounds, fed him what little she could find, and held his hand through the long, terrifying nights as he thrashed in his delirium. During one of these nights, as he lay shivering uncontrollably despite the heat radiating from his skin, she leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. "You will not leave me, Eli," she whispered fiercely, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. "We will live through this together, or we will die together. I would rather die here with you than live a single day in another man's lodge." But his fever only worsened. By the 5th day, he was completely unresponsive, his breathing shallow and ragged. She had done everything she knew how to do, and it wasn't enough. Utterly spent. She knelt beside him as a cold rain began to fall. She was not a pious woman. The hardships of her life had eroded any simple faith she might have once possessed. But now, with nothing left, she did the only thing she could. She bowed her head, closed her eyes, and prayed. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in, a raw, desperate, wordless plea sent from the depths of her soul. She prayed for a miracle, and then she slept, an exhausted, dreamless sleep, her head resting on his chest, the rain drumming a mournful dirge around them. When she awoke, the rain had stopped. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The ragged, labored sound of Eli's breathing was gone. A terrible, cold dread seized her. He was gone. She had failed. But then she felt a slight movement, a hand, weak but deliberate, came to rest on her hair. She lifted her head. Eli's eyes were open. They were clear. The fire of the fever was gone. His skin was cool to the touch. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a profound, weary gratitude. He had survived. Her prayer, against all odds, had been answered. Over the next week, he slowly regained his strength. Clara continued to care for him, foraging for food while he rested. As he grew stronger, they began to travel again, moving slowly, seeking a safe place, a permanent refuge. He was still weak, leaning on her for support, but they were a unit, bound together by the crucible of the past weeks. It was on a clear, crisp afternoon that they found it. They crested a small ridge and looked down into a hidden valley she had never seen before. It was a perfect bowl of green, sheltered on all sides by pine-covered hills. A wide, clear stream meandered through the center, its banks lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves had turned a brilliant gold. In the middle of the valley was a large, flat meadow of lush grass, a perfect place to build, to plant, to live. The air was still and peaceful, the only sound the gentle murmur of the water and the sigh of the wind in the pines. They stood there for a long time, looking down at the untouched beauty of the place. It was their dream from the lodge. Made real, it was a promise of a new beginning, a place where they could finally heal. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and they had come out the other side. Hand in hand, they started down the slope, leaving the wilderness of their suffering behind them and walking toward the first day of their new life. The weeks that followed were a testament to human resilience. The idyllic valley, their newfound sanctuary, was not a gentle paradise. It was a wilderness that demanded sweat, toil, and an unyielding will to survive. But for the first time, they were not surviving against something. They were building toward something. Their first home was little more than a crude lean-to, a temporary shelter against the wind and rain. While they began the monumental task of building a cabin, they had no tools save for Eli's knife and their own ingenuity. He became a master of improvisation. He found a hard, dense stone near the creek and painstakingly chipped and ground it against another until it had a workable edge. Then lashed it to a sturdy branch with wet rawhide from a deer he'd managed to kill. This primitive axe became the key to their future. The work was slow and brutal. Felling the slender lodgepole pines was an exhausting ordeal of chopping and burning at the base. Limbing them and dragging them to their building site was a trial of raw strength. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. He would handle the heavy chopping, his muscles cording with effort, while she would gather moss and clay from the creek bank to use as chinking against the wind. He taught her how to notch the logs so they would fit together, a simple but effective method he'd learned from his father. As the walls slowly rose, so did their spirits. Every log they placed was a victory, a declaration of their intent to put down roots in this wild, beautiful land. Clara, who had once known only the soft hands of a farmer's daughter, found a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. Her hands became calloused and strong, her body lean and tough. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by the singular, powerful vision of the home they were creating. While Eli hunted, his long absences a familiar ache in her chest, Clara made the nascent cabin her domain. She wove mats from the rushes that grew by the stream to cover the dirt floor. She used Eli's knife to carve crude bowls and spoons from soft cottonwood. She learned the patterns of the sun across the valley, the habits of the squirrels and the jays, the places where the sweetest berries grew. This small patch of earth was becoming her own. Their love, forged in the crucible of terror and desperation, settled into a deep and abiding companionship. It lived not in grand declarations, but in the quiet rhythms of their life. It was in the way she would keep a stew warm for him, no matter how late he returned from a hunt. It was in the way he would gently massage the ache from her shoulders after a long day of work. It was in the shared glances across their small fire at night, a universe of understanding passing between them without a single word. He was the solid, quiet earth beneath her feet. She was the steady, warming flame at the center of his world. They had no need for promises of forever. They were living it, one sunrise at a time. After nearly 2 months of relentless labor, the cabin was complete. It was a small, humble structure with a single room, a packed earth floor, and a roof of bark and sod. An opening covered by a hide served as a door, and a hole in the roof allowed smoke from their fire to escape. To the world, it was a primitive shack. To them, it was a palace. That first night they slept under a solid roof, sheltered from the wind, wrapped in each other's arms on a bed of soft pine boughs and furs, was the most profound peace either of them had ever known. Their peaceful isolation was shattered on a cold afternoon in late autumn. Eli was out checking his snares when Clara heard a sound that didn't belong in their valley, the exhausted braying of a mule, followed by human voices, faint and weary. Her first instinct was fear, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She grabbed Eli's knife from its peg and stood in the doorway of the cabin, her heart pounding. A small, bedraggled party of people emerged from the trees on the far side of the meadow. There were 4 of them, 2 men, a woman, and a young boy, leading a single, overburdened mule. They were clearly migrants, their clothes torn and dusty, their faces etched with hunger and exhaustion. They stopped when they saw the cabin, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. One of the men, older and stooped with weariness, approached cautiously, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice hoarse, "we mean you no harm. We're lost. Our wagon broke an axle 2 days back. We're trying to make for the settlement at Fort Bidwell." Clara relaxed her grip on the knife. These were not warriors or bandits. They were people in desperate need. She stepped out to meet them, and by the time Eli returned, she was sharing their meager supply of dried venison and camas bread with the strangers. The older man was a preacher, the Reverend Miller, his wife. Sarah was a quiet, gentle woman, and their son, Jacob, stared at Eli with wide, fearful eyes. The other man was a farmer named Peters. They had been part of a larger train but had gotten separated in the mountains. They were grateful beyond words for the food and shelter. That evening, as they all sat around the fire, the Reverend led them in a simple prayer of thanks, hearing the familiar words. The cadence of a life she had thought was lost forever stirred something deep within Clara. She looked at Eli, who sat slightly apart, his expression guarded, a man once again caught between 2 worlds. She looked at the simple, sacred bond between the Reverend and his wife, and she knew what she wanted. Later, after the others had bedded down for the night, she found the Reverend sitting alone by the stream, gazing at the stars. "Reverend?" she began, her voice hesitant. He turned, his face kind in the moonlight. "Yes, my child?" She twisted her hands together, the words catching in her throat. Eli and I, we have not been properly wed by a man of God." The Reverend's expression softened with understanding. He had seen the way she and the quiet, half-Modoc man looked at each other. He had seen the unspoken devotion, the fierce protectiveness. The Lord recognizes all unions of the heart. "Child, but if a ceremony would bring you peace, I would be honored to provide it." The wedding was the next morning. It was as simple and unadorned as the valley itself. They stood on the bank of the stream, the golden leaves of the cottonwoods their only decoration, the murmur of the water their only music. The Millers and Mr. Peters stood as their witnesses. Clara had washed her hair and wore her one simple dress, now faded and patched but clean. Eli stood beside her, his bearing solemn, his hand holding hers in a firm, warm grip. The Reverend's words were a quiet comfort, familiar verses about love and devotion that resonated in the wild, untamed church of the valley. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Clara felt a sense of profound peace settle over her. This was real. This was true. She turned to Eli, her heart full, and saw the same emotion reflected in his eyes. He leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear, and his voice was a low, rough whisper meant only for her. "I never learned the word for husband," he said, his voice thick with a feeling that went deeper than any vow. "And I never called anyone wife. But you, Clara, you are everything." Their happiness was a brief, perfect moment, a fragile bubble of peace in a harsh world. The next day, the migrants, rested and provisioned, continued on their journey, their hearts full of gratitude and their minds full of the incredible story they had to tell, of the half-breed scout and the brave white woman he had saved, living in a hidden paradise. They didn't know they were carrying a death sentence. 2 weeks later, the sound came again, but this time it was not the braying of a mule. It was the thunder of shod horses, the jangle of military tack, and the sharp, barked commands of an officer. A company of U.S. cavalrymen rode into the valley, their blue uniforms a violent slash of color against the autumn landscape. They surrounded the cabin, rifles at the ready. A young, officious-looking lieutenant with a neatly trimmed mustache dismounted and strode toward them. Eli had stepped in front of Clara, his body a shield, his face a mask of cold, hard fury. "Clara Thompson?" the lieutenant demanded, his eyes flicking past Eli as if he were an obstacle. "I am Clara Thompson," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Thank God we've found you," the officer said, a patronizing smile on his face. "We heard a wild tale from some settlers about a captive woman. You are safe now, ma'am. We've come to rescue you." He gestured with his glove toward Eli. "And to arrest this man for your kidnapping." The world stopped. "Kidnapping?" Clara cried, her voice incredulous. "Rescue me? This is my husband. This is my home." The lieutenant's smile faltered, replaced by an expression of pitying condescension. "Ma'am, you've clearly been through a terrible ordeal. It's not uncommon for captives to develop a misplaced affection for their captors. You're confused. We're taking you back to Fort Bidwell, where you can receive proper care." "I'm not confused," she insisted, her voice rising with panic. "I am here by my own choice. I love him." "Sergeant, take the woman into custody," the lieutenant ordered, ignoring her completely. Gently, 2 burly soldiers moved forward. Eli didn't resist. He knew it was hopeless. To fight would be to die, and to die would be to leave her alone. As the soldiers took Clara's arms, he met her eyes, his own filled with a look of such profound anguish and love that it shattered her heart. "No!" Clara screamed, struggling against their grip. "You can't do this! Eli!" She was pulled away, dragged toward a waiting horse. She fought, she kicked, she screamed his name over and over again. But it was no use. Her last sight of their perfect valley, their home, was of Eli being thrown to the ground, his hands bound roughly behind his back, his face pressed into the dirt of the paradise they had built together. The journey to Fort Bidwell was a journey back into a nightmare. Clara was no longer a person, but a piece of evidence, a fallen woman to be paraded as a cautionary tale. She was treated with a suffocating, condescending kindness that was more insulting than the Modoc's open hostility. The soldiers' wives clucked over her, offering her clean calico dresses that felt like costumes and bland, boiled food that tasted of ash. They spoke to her in hushed, pitying tones, as if she were a fragile doll that had been broken and needed mending. They did not see her. They saw only a lurid story, a victim of savage charms. Her protests were dismissed as trauma-induced hysteria. "Of course, dear, you think you love him," one of the officers' wives had said, patting her hand. "It's the shock, a terrible thing, what you've been through, but you're safe now. You'll forget all about that dreadful life in time." They kept her in a small, whitewashed room in the fort's infirmary, a comfortable prison with a barred window. Eli, she learned from a sympathetic young private, was being held in the stockade, a grim, windowless blockhouse reserved for violent criminals and deserters. He was to be tried by a military tribunal for kidnapping and inciting conflict with the native tribes. His fate, it was understood, was already sealed. A rope. The hearing, as they called it, was held 2 days later in the fort's main assembly hall. It was not a real trial for Clara, but an inquiry. A public spectacle designed to officially label her as a victim and condemn Eli as a villain. The room was packed with soldiers, settlers from the nearby area, and the curious townsfolk who had flocked to see the runaway girl. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, wet wool, and self-righteous judgment. Clara was seated on a single wooden chair at the front of the room. Facing a long table were the fort's commander, Major Harrison, sat as judge and prosecutor. He was a man with a stern, florid face and an unshakable belief in his own moral authority. He began by addressing the assembled crowd, his voice booming with sanctimony. "We are gathered here today not to condemn this poor woman, but to understand the nature of her terrible ordeal, to document the depravities she has suffered at the hands of the savage known as Eli, so that justice may be served swiftly." He then turned to Clara, his expression softening into one of feigned paternal concern. "Miss Thompson, tell us how this man took you against your will from the Modoc camp."
He didn't,
Clara said, her voice clear and steady, ringing out in the silent room.
He saved me. He protected me from Chief Cale, who meant to force himself upon me.
A murmur rippled through the crowd. Major Harrison's face tightened. "Protected you, ma'am. This man is a half-breed, little better than the savages who captured you. He saw an opportunity. He took you for himself, did he not?"
"He made me his wife to give me his protection under their law,"
she stated, lifting her chin. "It was the only way."
"His wife?"
The major's voice dripped with scorn. "A heathen ceremony in the woods has no meaning here. Before God and the United States Army. He took you to his bed, did he not? He took advantage of your fear and confusion." The question was a physical blow. Clara felt the blood rush to her cheeks, the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her. The women in the audience whispered behind their hands, their faces a mixture of pity and salacious curiosity. She was being shamed. Her most private moments turned into a public spectacle of degradation.
"I went to him of my own free will,"
she said, her voice trembling but defiant.
"I love him."
The words were met with a collective gasp. It was the confession they had all been waiting for, the proof of her fall from grace. Major Harrison sighed, a sound of theatrical sadness.
"The poor child is utterly lost,"
he said to the room at large.
"Her mind has been twisted by this creature. She has forgotten her place, her people, her God.
She has been tempted by the wilderness, and she has fallen. There is nothing more to be said." He banged a small gavel on the table. "This inquiry is closed. The prisoner Eli will be hanged at dawn for his crimes."
"No!"
Clara screamed, leaping to her feet.
"You can't! He's innocent!"
2 soldiers moved to restrain her, their hands gripping her arms. And at that exact moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung open with a loud creak. Every head turned. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning light, stood a lone figure. It was Eli. He was not the man they had dragged from the valley. He was clean, his dark hair damp and combed back from his face. He was wearing a simple, clean white shirt and dark trousers, the clothes of a civilized man. But he stood with the unshakable stillness of a mountain, his moccasined feet planted firmly on the wooden floor. His hands were empty. He was unarmed. His face was a mask of calm determination. But his hazel eyes, blazing with an intense light, were fixed on only one person, Clara. A wave of shock and confusion swept through the room. Major Harrison shot to his feet, his face turning a shade of purple. "What is the meaning of this? Guards, seize that man!" "I am not here to fight," Eli said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall. He took a single step forward, and the soldiers hesitated, caught off guard by his sheer presence. "I am here as a witness,
I am here to speak the truth." He walked, not with a swagger, but with a slow, deliberate grace, down the central aisle. The crowd parted before him as if he were a ghost. He stopped directly in front of the Major's table, turning his body so he was addressing the entire room, the jury of his accusers. "You call this woman a victim," he began, his voice resonating with a power that defied his simple words. "You look at her and see a fallen dove. You are wrong. I have seen her at her weakest, covered in the dust of her family's ruin, and I have seen her at her strongest, fighting for my life with nothing but a sharp rock and the fire in her soul. She is not a dove. She is an eagle." He turned his gaze to Clara, and the entire room seemed to fade away. "You say I tempted her. You say I used savage charms to twist her mind. You are wrong again. Her love is not a sickness. It is her strength. I did not take her. I did not steal her. She walked to me in the darkest hour of her life. And she chose. She chose to live. She chose to fight. She chose me." He faced the Major again, his eyes locking with the commander's. "She is not a captive. She is not a runaway girl. She is my wife, my partner, the other half of my heart. Her only crime in your eyes is that she gave that heart to a man with the wrong blood in his veins." He took a deep breath, and his next words were a challenge, a vow, a final, unbreakable truth. "If her crime is loving me, then hang us both." A profound, absolute silence fell over the hall. No one moved. No one breathed. The raw, undeniable power of his love, spoken so plainly and fearlessly, had stunned them all. It was a truth that transcended prejudice, a force that their narrow laws and bitter hatreds could not comprehend. Major Harrison stood speechless, his mouth agape, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief. He was about to order the guards to seize Eli, to end this insane spectacle, when a new voice broke the silence. "The man speaks the truth." The voice belonged to an older woman who had just risen from her seat in the front row. She was Martha Simmons, the wife of the town blacksmith, a woman known for her sharp tongue and unwavering common sense. Her face was lined with age and wisdom, and she looked at the Major without a trace of fear. "I knew Clara's mother," Martha said, her voice clear and strong. "I knew her father. They were good, strong people from Kansas who raised their daughter to have a mind of her own. They did not raise a weakling to be coddled and protected. They raised a woman to choose her own path. I look at Clara Thompson, and I do not see a fallen woman. I see her mother's strength. I see her father's spirit." She turned to the rest of the room. "Are we to be the kind of people who punish a woman for having courage, for choosing love in a world that has given her nothing but grief? I say she has earned her happiness. She has a right to it, and a right to the man she has chosen, no matter the color of his skin." A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Minds were changing. Hearts were softening. The solid wall of prejudice had been cracked, first by a love that would rather die than deny itself, and then by the simple, undeniable voice of common decency. Major Harrison looked at the faces in the crowd, at the determined old woman, and at the two people standing before him, an unbreakable unit against the world. He saw his authority, his entire worldview crumbling, defeated. He slumped into his chair. "This proceeding is a farce," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He banged his gavel weakly. "The prisoner is released. This matter is closed." For a moment, no one moved. Then, as two soldiers moved forward and cut the ropes that had been hastily tied around Eli's wrists for the walk from the stockade, Clara broke free from her own guards. She ran. She flew across the space that separated them and threw herself into his arms. He caught her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair, in the middle of the crowded assembly hall, before the eyes of the entire fort. They clung to each other, two halves made whole. The stares were no longer filled with hate or scorn, but with a grudging, stunned silence. The prejudice had not vanished from the world, but in that moment, In that embrace, it had been broken. The journey back to their valley was quiet. They walked side by side, their hands clasped together, their steps light with a freedom they had never known. When they crested the final ridge and saw their small, perfect meadow spread out below them, a sense of peace, profound and complete, settled over them. Their cabin stood waiting, a humble, sturdy monument to their will to survive. They stopped in the doorway, looking out at the stream glittering in the afternoon sun, at the golden leaves of the cottonwoods, at the silent, watchful pines. This was their sanctuary, their fortress, their home. They had been torn apart by the savage wilderness and the even more savage world of men. But they had endured. They had fought their way back, not just to a place, but to each other. Here, in the heart of the wild, their love, born of fire and tempered by hardship, had finally found its forever. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts. We love hearing from you.